We're going to look a little bit at some different architecture patterns, how we set up our projects in Android Studio. And these follow some, well, we're going to look at some of the common methods out there. The idea is we're going to want to separate our programming logic, our business logic from our GUI, our user interface, Android development stuff. And there's a couple common ways of doing this, and we'll also get into projects where there's a database backend often, and so we often talk about model view controllers, model view presenters, or model view models. We're going to look at three postings to a blog by Florina Mutenscu. Florina used to work for Google, and in fact, this is her presenting at Google's developer show in 2017 in India. But she's now working independently. But these are back when she was working with Google. They're somewhat dated, 2016, and this video is just 2017, but I think they're still really good. Back then, about 4 years ago, and even 10 years ago, there was a lot of debate about what the best model was. We're going to end up using this model view model, and that's now the Google standard, and we'll talk about that later on when we get down here. But let's just look at these three models and see what they do. So the oldest type of model was called model view controller here. And when you see something like this, you can think of three different objects. The data model. So the model is always the data model, the backend data, or something like that. And the view is always the user interface, the GUI part of this. And then usually there's some part in between there that's separating the backend data or business logic from the front end user interface. And in this case, it's called a controller. So this article just talks a little bit about what the model is. Again, model is a data layer, the view is the UI layer, and the controller is this logic that works on this behavior. Now, one problem with the model view controller was that it still allowed the view to access and get data from the data model directly here, or to send data to the data model directly. And nowadays we largely eliminate this. So we want this separation. So this is the main reason why we no longer use model view controller, is this line here. Okay, the next model here is a model view presenter. And so the controller is changed to a presenter idea here. So the presenter retrieves data from the data model and applies UI logic and works with the views for that. And again, so we still have the same data layer and UI layer. And so here's where we have our data model here, we have our views, and again, we might have multiple different screens or views here, and then we will have a presenter here that controls it. And so for every view, we have one presenter, and that interfaces with the model. And this one-to-one is going to be important in just a sec when we talk about the next version of this. But so every view, every screen, we have a different presenter created here. They might be implementing some interfaces or working with some interfaces here when they work for this. But this is the basic setup here. Now the final version we're going to look at is the model view model version here. And similar here, we've got our data model and our view, and in between we have a view model in between here. And so again, data storage here and business logic, and then the view is the user interface, and then the view model is, again, sits in between here. But now we can have multiple views run by the same view model if need be, and often we might have multiple screens or related screens here, so related views here, all controlled by the single view model for this. So, and this is the architecture we'll be using in Android Studio. So this is a nice little kind of overview, nice interview with her. She's, I don't know who you follow on Twitter, if you use Twitter or other social media, but it's, I think it's good to follow people like this who have interesting discussions about new architectures and stuff like that. Now there's a couple other tutorials here. This one is by Lars Vogela. Lars created a whole bunch of really nice tutorials back in the about 2015, 2016. And they've been updated somewhat, but lately they used to not have really any ads to them, and now they have ads all over them. So that, although it's still good, they have lots of advertisements here. But again, same sort of talk about model view presenter, talks about how data will flow, talks about the view here, model view controller and stuff like that. And then this view model, and the model here with the data, the business logic here, the presentation logic here, and the user interface here. So that's just another version of this. And then Geeks, for Geeks, similar sort of summary pattern of all three models here. So just again, some different places where you can go and look at these uh, three comparisons. And again, we're going to look at this view models in Android. And Lila, this is another good Google developer and her work with these. So Lila Fujiwara, again, another nice description. This walks through an actual Android version of this and talks about view model and how to set this up, and talks about the whole activity cycle and how the activity cycle will run through this. And we'll come back to this in just a little bit. And this is actually the Android documentation for there's a built-in view model in Android that we'll be using, and again talks about that, and again talks about this architecture, and we'll revisit this in just in the second half of this lecture when we start talking about examples. So in the next couple of videos, we'll look at three different samples: a really simple sample without any sort of architecture, a kind of homebrewed version of this with a kind of a model view controller kind of, or a model view presenter kind of look, and then the more official Google version, the preferred version with model view model. So that'll be the next three videos.